If we don't intentionally create our culture, the culture creates itself.
Hey, it's Brad here. And before we get into the show, I want to tell you about the show sponsor. Now, I personally use this company in my own business. And so I was thrilled whenever they reached out and said they wanted to sponsor the show. Today's sponsor is JobTread. JobTread is an all-in-one construction management software. JobTread streamlines processes for builders and contractors from estimating and scheduling to job costing and invoicing. With JobTread, you can create precise estimates quickly, improving the chance of winning jobs, and their dynamic scheduling allows you to keep projects on track with Gantt charts and scheduling tools. JobTread also allows you to collaborate with teams, vendors, and clients in one location. No more missed information, who said, she said. It's all in one location. And their API integration tools connect with your favorite software like QuickBooks Online, Hammer CRM, or any other API-friendly apps. JobTread is perfect for builders and contractors of all sizes. Whether you're a solo contractor or run a large team, JobTread scales to fit your needs and works great for remodelers, home builders, deck builders, pool builders, and general contractors. Try JobTread today and learn how it can help streamline, manage, and grow your construction business. Visit jobtread.com or click the link in the show notes for more details. Now let's get to the show. Welcome back to the show. Today I have another very special guest with me, Traci Austin with the Elevated Talent Consulting. Traci, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me, Brad.
So give us just a little bit of a background about you and what you do, kind of 30,000 foot view, just a general overview of how you help people.
Yeah, absolutely. So we work with blue collar trade organizations, mostly, the mom and pop organizations, folks less than, mostly between 10 and 20 employees, and really helping them optimize their people. And what I mean by that is cutting through the noise around, I don't want to work, we don't have any good workers, those kind of things, to get some motivation and then to start to get some systems in place to consistently have high performance and pull in top people you want working with you.
So how did you get into the HR aspect? Did you work in corporate America before? Like, give us kind of a little background on how you got into it.
Yeah, so I'll do both HR so I grew up in construction. So my dad ran, my dad and my grandpa ran a home building business for several years, and my dad now runs a GC. So grew up in that. But then when I went to school, it was not in HR. My mom was in HR. You like how this works? Right. And so ended up in HR and working for a lot of very small organizations, building HR departments from the ground up. And, a lot of those ended up, once I shifted over to consulting, ended up being small businesses. So in nonprofits for 10 years, building HR departments, then shifted to consulting.
Makes sense. Yeah. So you had the perfect combination, the contractor and the HR, right? And they're... Mm-hmm. And you got to grow up experiencing both of that. So that makes that transition makes complete sense. I'm going to ask a different question kind of right off the bat. What would you say is like, when, as a contractor, when do I need to start worrying about putting like HR team, whether it's a person or a consultant, like when do I need to start worrying about that?
Yeah. So here's what I would say is it's first a mindset before it is anything else. It is the mindset of knowing, okay, yes, there are some very compliance related things. I'm not going to bore you with that. But like the second you get somebody on payroll, unfortunately, the law says you need to know all the laws. This is where pull an expert in. You don't want to be bogged down with that. Pull an expert in that can say, here's what you need to do right now to have yourself protected. Yet having the mindset around, most of the small businesses we work with, like that first employee is a son, a buddy, an uncle, something like that, right?
Right.
And
right.
It's shifting the mindset from we are now in an employment relationship versus going drinking beers, which we'll do at 9:00 tonight, right? Like there is a shift that does need to happen in the mindset.
That makes sense. The one thing the law everyone breaks that just came to my head when you were talking is like the labor poster that the poster board you got to put on the wall with all the labor laws and stuff. Like that's a requirement. And most people have no idea that they have to have just that simple little thing to be in code of the law.
And work comp. Don't forget work comp. That's going to get you.
Oh yeah. Yeah. So, okay. So whenever, when you go into an organization, let's say I have, I'm a contractor, I have 10 employees and I want to start putting stuff into place into my business, like a system or a process, HR related, that type of thing. Where do you start? If I brought you in as a consultant, where do you start with that?
Yeah, that's such a great question. So we have an audit that we're going to do to begin with that really goes through the checklist of all the laws, because there are different laws that kick into place for different numbers of employees. And you have state laws, you have federal laws, then you have laws based on the jurisdiction. Like City of Chicago has very different laws than outside of it, right? And so we're going to go through a checklist with that. There's a lot of systems and tools that you can use that make this so much easier, especially for really small organizations. Getting the right payroll system that actually has a lot of this stuff built in that keeps you from paper files. Like, let's get away from paper files immediately. I like Gusto as a payroll system. Okay. Not being paid to say that, right? But like we use Gusto. I like Gusto as a payroll system for small employers just because it's super easy. You can do everything electronic. You can do your 1099 contractors on there as well. There are some that are construction specific, but that's a pretty easy one that has a pretty low cost to it that allows you to ensure you've got compliance right away.
Yeah, I have a few clients that use Gusto. So, okay. So we got to get that set up. What else do we got to worry about getting set up?
Yeah. It's really important to have an employee handbook. And I know I get a lot of eye rolls on that, but you do need to have an employee handbook because you need to be able to cover those laws. And guess what? If it's not in writing, it didn't happen. So, we need to make sure we have an offer letter. We need to make sure we have a job description, and we need to make sure we have a handbook. So the way I like to describe that is your handbook is one to many. You have one handbook for everyone in your organization, with the exception as to if they're in different states. Now, that's a completely different conversation about where are we working versus where's the home office. But bottom line is you need an employee handbook that's specific to your state. You need to have a job description that names the essential duties of the position that they are in. And those essential duties need to pair our way with the requirements. So what are the physical requirements? This is really important, especially for the trades, because you don't want to get slammed with a work comp or something like that, or American Disabilities Act. And by signing that, they're saying, yes, they can do it, and it's a requirement of their job. And so that becomes really important later on. So handbook, job description, and then that we're doing the offer letter. And the offer letter, again, is 1-to-1.
So you're saying the text that says, hey, you're hired, I could pay you, $20 an hour, start on Monday. That's not good enough.
No. Because guess what? We, in the U.S., other than in Montana, we have employment at will. At will is a doctrine. It is not a law. And I hope I'm not speaking over the heads of your folks here, right? But this is a really important distinction. You are required to follow the laws. Most folks, especially the small businesses, are like, yeah, but we've got employment at will. I can fire them at any time for any reason, right? With the exception of any law. Therefore, your handbook covers the laws. Your job description allows you to say, hey, you can't lift 50 pounds, 75% of the time or more. I can terminate you because this is an essential function of the law. And then you all of a sudden get, a lawsuit later and it says, hey, it's an American Disabilities Act lawsuit, and you say, hey, they don't meet the essential functions, and it says right here in the job description that they signed. And right. So these are ways to protect yourself from some, very expensive, consequences later. Yeah,
I learned 2 lessons the hard way in regards to employee handbooks. The first one, before I even had an employee handbook, I had an employee, we were working on a job, had a disagreement, he got upset, walked off the job, essentially quit, right? He just left. And then, he kind of came back and was like, all right, so I was like, let's just take a couple days and think about it. I thought about it, went to him and I said, look, this ain't going to work out. We're going to split ways, right? He turned in unemployment and said that he was laid off for no work. And I had no handbook to outline that. And so the lady from the state who called me was like, well, do you have a handbook and lay this out? I said, no. Okay, well, there's nothing you can do to fight it then. And luckily, he ended up getting another job before it ever went through. But simply because of that, I mean, he actually quit first but I didn't have anything laid out in the handbook of like how to deal with that.
Right.
And so I went and got a handbook.
Yeah.
I did that. But the second thing I learned is I hired a guy, and because he had already had a vacation planned when I hired him, that was like 3 weeks after he started, I said, I'll honor that. No problem. I have a PTO thing. You acquire them over certain days worked, and I said, I'll just go ahead and give them to you up front, even though you haven't worked here. Like, I was trying to be accommodating for him. Mm-hmm. Well, ended up firing him like 2 weeks later because he, did not fit. And when it came down to the check, they go, what about the PTO? I was like, what do you mean? Well, you said that it was guaranteed as part of it. And so I didn't have it outlined as like, you lose these benefits if you get fired or you quit.
Right.
And so I could have fought it and probably won. I just ended up going ahead and paying them for the PTO. But I learned that lesson. Like, all these things matter whenever it comes time to actually implement them.
Right. Now, you just named something really important here. So your handbook says what the policy is. In your offer letter, is any deviation to what's in the handbook policy that's one-off or somebody you're hiring needs to be in that offer letter. Now, note, a caveat I'm going to say is be careful here because you want to ensure you're not discriminating against folks where you're only doing it for one class and not another. So that's a different conversation, but it's important to note. So anything like that, you want to name in the offer letter. And the offer letter is going to cover some really important things. Where are they working from? Now, construction trades, it's going to be, it's typically the job site. So you're going to need to rate that a little bit differently. But it's the hourly wage and what it is, and benefits and policies all refer to the employee handbook. The reason why you want to refer to the employee handbook or the summary plan description for benefits is you don't want to have to go back and change an offer letter every single time. Right. And for one-offs, like what you just talked about with PTO, you want to name that this is an exception based on hire only for this period of time. And then it reverts back to whatever is in the handbook policy. See what we did there? We pulled it out so that it's just for this, but then it reverts back to the handbook policy after X period of time.
That makes sense. Yeah. You want your standardized in the handbook and then your specialized or one-off in the offer letter, which is really what I did. There was something that was, and you may know this, but it's like, it was literally just a word. Like, whether you say PTO is a benefit or it's like a compensation or something, it's just literally how you define it. One is guaranteed, the other is not. And that was something I learned the hard way. It was, so I had to change that.
Yeah. So does that PTO, get added in every single pay period that we're going to add in 1.27 hours, right?
Right.
Or do you get it up front at the beginning of the year? And it matters. And it matters based on the state as well. And some states are very, very different than others. I live right on the border of Wisconsin and Illinois, and state laws incredibly different between the two states. And so it's really important that you understand what those state laws are, especially if you're working in multiple states.
Well, that little example of how nuanced, like the terminology in the words of how you define PTO is so nuanced that if you don't have an expert or don't know what you're doing, you're going to do what I did and you're going to learn the hard way, and you're going to end up, paying a bunch of money that you didn't plan on it. This is just to confirm, like, when you start getting into this part of the business, you really need to know what you're doing, or you need to hire someone like yourself to come in and help you set that stuff up.
Right. And, so often as I'm explaining to clients, or they'll call me after the fact and they just spent $4,000 or $5,000 on a project, to get somebody off the books or to take care of it, or unemployment or whatever it is. It's like, well, we could have taken care of this for your entire company for that amount of money. And now they're having to almost pay it twice because now they have to fix it, but yet they still had to pay for the mistake.
Yeah.
On this vein, one thing I want to talk about, because this has happened several times with clients, is defining what your wages are and being really clear around what this is. So often I've had clients that, hey, I'm just going to give them additional compensation because of whatever, but they don't define what it is. There's a distinction between an hourly employee and an employee who you're paying the same amount every single week. Well, guess what? there's very specific rules around who we can pay hourly and who we can pay based on a salary. And, I've seen so many clients do this incorrectly and have to pay overtime back, and then they audit all your records for 3 years. So just be really careful of how you are paying folks if they truly are an hourly employee, which will be most of your, common trades workers. Pay them hourly. You have to pay overtime over, those 40 hours in a week.
Yeah, you can't override the state law in terms
or the
of
federal
how
law.
you pay, unless you want to get in trouble.
Right. And here's where most employers get caught, is they get caught in unemployment. And so this is really important, I think, for your folks to hear, is where the investigations start to come in is somebody claims unemployment, you fight it, and then they start asking questions and start bringing up wages. Now all of a sudden they're digging into all this, and then it gets elevated. So unemployment talks with several other agencies. There's about 9 different agencies that will end up talking to each other. So that's where most of these things come up, is in unemployment. And so I'm just naming that to say, having handbook, job description, and offer letter in place to begin with is going to save you a lot of headache later. Start there.
Yeah, one thing you don't want to mess with is unemployment.
No.
And wages, wages, period. Like, you do not want to mess with people's wages. I went through that myself personally when I worked for a contractor, and I had got fired / mutually quit, and he was holding my last paycheck until he felt like he was, he needed something back. I don't remember what it was. And the state, and at least in Indiana where I'm at, they don't mess around with paychecks and unemployment.
Nope.
And they will fine you like you've never been fined before.
Right.
So this is definitely something important. This whole area around payroll and pay and employment, we don't want to mess around with this. We got to have this right so that we don't get into trouble very quickly.
Right. And it's different for each state. So when you have to pay an employee based on their last day work, changes by state. So just know that. And where you can find that is if you go on your state website and just look up, last day, final paycheck within whatever state, you can find it that way. So I want to make sure we've got some really tangible how-tos for folks if this is like, wait, what do I do? What do I do now? So, but that's key, is knowing what it is for your state, and it's different for every state.
Yeah, I think most states have on their website. I mean,
Yep.
They have a website that's pretty easy to go to and get that information. I just know people that are like, well, I'm not going to pay you until you pay back for these tools that you lost or whatever. It's like, you just can't do that. Like, if someone worked the hours, you owe them that money.
Correct.
Regardless of if they owe you money.
Yep.
You can't bargain like that. And
they have to sign something talking about payroll deduction. So if you are going to deduct, let's say, tools, right? So they have a $200 tool allowance, but you'll allow them to go up to $500. So they need to repay you $300. They need to sign an agreement with you that says, I agree for you to withhold $25 per paycheck for X number of paychecks. And if I am terminated or decide to leave before the final date, I will pay the X amount within that. The caveat is every state also says how much you can withhold per paycheck. So there's a certain percentage that you can withhold. You can never take a whole check. The other thing to note is if you have garnishments that start to come in here, whether that's child support or tax, those garnishments go first. There's a very specific order to this. Again, I don't want to go over people's heads. I did payroll for several years. I've got those certifications. So with that, make sure you talk to somebody that has that. And using a system like Gusto, they've got folks there that can support it if you're not using a third party for that. But ensure you're getting the advice from somebody that does this every day, because it changes significantly.
Yeah, I mean, it's no different than taxes, right? Like, you got to have an accountant because that stuff changes by the minute.
Yeah.
So we talked about payroll and all the how important it is to get the payroll stuff, the employment stuff. Besides those things, what do you see contractors doing wrong in terms of around the HR side of business? What do they get wrong? The most common thing?
Yeah, they're not building the relationships. And here's what I mean. When we've got a great relationship with somebody, they're more likely to come talk to us because we've built trust versus going to the state. And so, the key here I see is when we can build those relationships and keep this stuff in-house, you need to be honest. You need to make sure you're doing the right things with it, of course, but build the relationship so that they come to you first. It's going to be much less costly that way. So I'm going to name that first because we could all do that, and, it sounds like, a lot of your folks are still playing with tools, right? They're still out on job sites. Build a relationship with your guys and gals. Figure out what is it that they want? What is it that they like? What is most important to them? And start building those in conversations and just name, hey, if there's anything that ever comes up on, pay this or that or whatever else, let us know because we want to make sure it's right. And that relationship goes a long way. So aside from that, the next thing really is the pay. And I'm actually having this conversation with several clients right now. Pay has gone up so significantly in the last couple of years. I mean, when you look at the stats on it, it was like 13.2% in, I think, 22, then it was 6%, then it was another 3%. So like we've had some significant increases. And I really want you to think about, is it going to be more productive for me to retain my current team members or to hire new folks in? And my guess is it's going to be better to retain your current team members.
Oh, yeah. It's always cheaper.
Absolutely. And so take a look at what your pay is right now. Are you paying below market and you're truly, at risk of losing some of your key people? Because it'll cost you a lot more to hire somebody in, but it's also going to take the time to build the trust again, which is what I just talked about. Right? Most folks aren't going to leave just because of pay. Something else has to be wrong for them to start looking. But when we can look at that and say, hey, we know that the market just increased almost 20% over the last 5 years. You know what? What are we going to do to ensure that our rates are, somewhat match that? And even just a little bit incrementally tells, the folks, we really value you. And here's the other things as well. So that's one to take a look at. And then, of course, just make sure you're actually keeping track of the time. This is one that comes up quite significantly, is that you're not tracking time. So ins and outs for lunches is really important. Are you auto deducting lunches or are they actually, timing in and out for lunches? There's a lot of great, contractor apps out there now that time is included in it with your billing costs, et cetera. But if you're still doing these things via paper, figure out a way to get an electronic timekeeping system because it'll save you tons of headache later. Because otherwise, if you are ever audited, what ends up happening is they're going, it's a he said, she said between the interview with the employee and then the interview with you. And then they come up with what they believe is the right thing. And that can be significant dollars. And so having correct timekeeping is really important.
Hey, just a quick time out from the show. If you're a frustrated contractor who's dealing with low profit margins, stuck working on the tools every day, or doing free estimates for people who are never going to hire you in the first place, I invite you to my private contractor community, the Profit Club, where contractors just like you are adding 2 to 3 times more profit each year without producing any more jobs and finally getting completely off the tools to never do another free estimate again. So if you're ready to increase your profits, stop doing free estimates and get off the tools, then all you have to do is click the link in the show notes to learn more about the Profit Club and see how I can easily 2 to 3 times the cash in your pocket, give you a proven sales process that will convert more jobs with ease and get you off the tools once and for all. And the best part is you can do all of this without having to produce more jobs than you currently are. Click the link to learn more. Now let's get back to the show. Yeah, the lunch thing is a big deal. I know a lot of my clients, they'll pay lunch for the guys, whether it's like they literally will buy them lunch or they just pay them for their lunch. Like they'll pay, they can take a 30-minute lunch, but they get paid for that time, right. Their hourly wage. And that adds up pretty quick, right? Especially when you have more people. It may make sense if you have 1 or 2 guys and, you buy them lunch every other day, no big deal. Now you grow and you got 15 people. You can't buy lunch for everybody all the time. You're going to start burning up all your money. So like some things work at a small scale, but don't necessarily work at a large scale. Right. And then you get into, well, why does he, why do we get free lunches for 2 years? And then now that we have more people, I don't get free lunches anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So you run into that kind of scenario where you shoot yourself in the foot later on.
Yeah, for sure. And what you're getting into, I absolutely love, is we're getting into culture. And what is the culture of the organization that we're creating? And if we don't intentionally create our culture, the culture creates itself. And it's like I've walked into trades clients where, we've got come-alongs being thrown across the yard, and I'm going, what's happening here? Right? And that's seen as okay. And there's no repercussions to those individuals. Well, we're creating a culture that we probably don't want to have. And so, really think about, what is your culture? Here's how we define culture. We define culture as the behaviors that you allow and don't allow inside your organization. It's a simple definition, right?
Yeah.
But what are you allowing, right? And then you start to consciously create it. Like throwing a come along across the yard is probably not a good culture we want to have, right? So we're going to then not allow that behavior, probably terminate that guy, because we've got a long list of things that does not align with. But then shifting into, what is the behavior we want? And as that leader or that owner, you need to emulate that behavior, right? And so that behavior is also how you're showing up to work and what your behaviors are every day as well. And, culture is one that can breed mistrust really, really fast, and can breed lots of great trust really fast as well.
Yeah, I've talked a lot about it on the podcast, and in my coaching group, we talk about it a lot. It only takes one bad employee to really ruin that culture in an organization. Especially, it's like, oh, well, that's John. He's always 5-10 minutes late, but he knows how to do everything, and he's the guy we go to get stuff done. So we just kind of look a different way. You know what I mean? And so, but the other 5 people that show up on time or early every day, what does that do to them? Like, how do they feel about that? Yeah. And so you're basically telling people it's okay to break the rules here in this organization. We'll just kind of pick and choose. And like, again, back to the culture side of it, like, that's not, if you're going to have standards, then you need to hold those standards to all your employees across the board.
Yeah. And I find so often is we don't know how to address it. And so there's a 4-part kind of thing that I like to use. And I learned this from my coach, and, but it's, when you show up 5 minutes late, I receive that as being blown off and I feel disrespected. Is that what you meant by that? 4 parts. I receive that as, I feel, yes, I know we're talking about feelings, but it is important because it impacts the entire culture. Is that what you mean? Is that what you mean? Puts the accountability back on them to own their actions, their words, and their behaviors.
I like that. Is that what you mean? Yeah. I love that, the way you phrase that.
I stole it, or I borrowed it. It wasn't mine to begin with. Always give credit where it's due, right?
Well, a lot of the stuff is just regurgitated, right?
It is. It is.
Just repackaged and resold.
Yeah.
So, is that what you mean? Yeah. Whenever you show up late, it feels like you're disrespecting me. Is that what you mean? Is that how you want me to interpret that?
Right. My joke when, this was taught to me is, can I have a list of words to use for I receive that as and I feel? But it's like, I receive that as being blown off and I feel disrespected, or, I receive that as you not caring about the team and I feel, whatever. Is that what you mean? And it squarely puts it back on them, but it's not in a confrontational way that we're going to start a fight. And I think so many of these tough conversations, I'll call them tough conversations. Whenever we get into accountability conversations, it's like, well, I don't want to have that conversation because I'm afraid I'm going to piss them off and they do all these things great, and then I'm not going to have them as an employee. If we live out of fear, we're lowering the bar of our expectations and we're telling everyone else that that's okay, versus standing into what is it that we want and need as an organization and starting to have the accountability be peer-to-peer versus just top-down.
Well, you said exactly usually what it is. It's out of fear, because it is hard to find good people, right? And so it's like, well, yeah, he's got a flaw, but I can deal with it because I need bodies. I need people that can do work, right? And so I'm going to just give him a little bit of the flaws, but you really can't do that, because it's going to continue to get worse and worse. And usually, not always, but my experience is like, if you give people an inch, they're going to take a mile. They're going to keep pushing that boundary to see what they can get away with. Because if if they're a good person, good employee, they want to do well, usually they don't have those bad habits or they're not doing those things. The people that are doing those things are the kind of people that will continue to take advantage of it, over a period of time.
Right.
So has that been your experience?
Yeah, it absolutely has. The other part of this that I see is, look at what your turnover has been. When folks voluntarily leave, why are they leaving? And who's leaving? Are our best performers leaving or our worst performers are leaving? If your best performers are leaving, it tells you have accountability issue and you're not holding your worst performers accountable. And what happens is then when you hire folks in, who's training them? Your worst performers.
Yeah.
So now we've just spiraled into the quality of our work and our expectations are on the floor versus where we want them to be.
I have a client of mine went through a specific, very similar scenario, and he probably, I'm not going to say who it is, but he knows I'm talking about him. But he had two lead guys, and they were like, the two lead guys didn't like each other. And so there was like, well, so-and-so did this and so-and-so did that. And there was a lot of trying to throw each other under the bus. And at the end of the day, the one who seemed like he was the good one and the one that seemed like he was the bad one, it was actually the complete opposite. And, after one person he laid one person off or got rid of them, other employees came and said, you actually fired the wrong person. You should have fired the other guy. And so especially when you're not on the tools with them and you're not out there working side by side with them 8 hours a day, and you only have 10, 15 minutes of contact in the morning or an hour in the afternoon or whatever, and you have to kind of rely more on the team and, and information getting back to you, it can be easy to miss a lot of this stuff. Mm-hmm. So how do you, what's your suggestion on how to keep a pulse on your team and your culture if you are removed from, working side by side with them?
Yeah, absolutely. There's two pieces here that I want to talk about. And so one is triangulation, which we'll talk about in a second. You're going, what is that? And then the second one is, really, I'm a fan of doing surveys on your phone, have it be a QR code. Everybody has a cell phone, make them quick and easy. But one of the questions with surveys is, they can be 3 questions, but, who is the guy that you go to when you have an issue? Who is the guy or the gal that you go to that you never want to go to because they create a bigger issue for you to solve later? Those 2 questions tell you who your key people are. And a lot of times they're the really, really quiet ones that don't want to be seen. And they're not going to raise the fuss. They're not going to pat themselves on the back, but they're the ones that behind the scenes are kind of that grease that's keeping everything moving forward. The best way to get to know what's going on is to talk to your people. And sometimes that's formal, sometimes that's informal. Sometimes that's being out on the tools and just having a conversation. Again, build the trust. And sometimes it's just quick surveys that are anonymous that essentially say, hey, who do you go to and why? And who do you not go to and why?
I like that.
And by the way, having drop downs with names versus them having to type it in makes it easier for them to actually answer the thing.
Well, that's true. Yeah. I mean, it's not that hard to, you could easily put a form or survey together doing that. That makes sense. I like that. How often would you do that survey?
You can, those questions I just asked, I like to do when we do our annual reviews, when they're doing the self-assessment, but I also like doing some sort of a pulse survey, on at least on a quarterly basis, where you're essentially saying, hey, scale of 1 to 5, how are things going? Scale of 1 to 5, how's the culture? Now, I probably won't use culture. The guy is like, hey, how do you feel at work? Scale of 1 to 5, do you want to come here in the morning? The questions that they can answer that is literally 1 to 5, 1 to 5, 1 to 5. And it will just give you a pulse. Again, make it less than 3 minutes, something quick that they can do that gives you a pulse on what's going on. And that allows you to start comparing data over time. Because when we can start comparing data over time and seeing, all right, we've got Tyler, who is kind of the lead here, and we've got Chris, who's the lead here, and we have Javier over here. I'm not asking the name of the guy filling it out. I am asking who their supervisor is. Now we can start to see the distinctions between the supervisors as well.
Makes sense. Yeah. I really like that idea. And the anonymous part is obviously important because a lot of guys, especially, on the front lines, they're not going to go rat out their friends or, their coworkers or especially their superiors. Like they're not going to, because they're retaliation, right? Like they're afraid of retaliation or that
Absolutely.
information getting back. So you have to have it anonymous.
And in a small environment, if you're less than 15 employees or whatnot, like they don't want to rat each other out.
No.
Yet at the same time, they don't want to be in a work environment that isn't fun and that they don't want to go to every day. So, I mean, I think that that's another key piece to it. I want to jump back to the triangulation piece as you're talking about the two supervisors, because I don't want to lose this piece because I do think it's really important. Is, so often when we've got two employees, two leads, two whatever that aren't getting along, if you're going back and forth between them, they're spinning the words and making you the bad guy. Therefore, all three of you get in a room together. Here's what I'm hearing. Help me understand what's happening. And I force the conversations to happen. And guess what? That little 4-part thing we just talked about, when you two consistently throw each other under the bus, I receive that as a disrespectful to our team. And I feel like you don't want to be here. Is this what you mean? And now you're putting it back on both of them and you're forcing the conversation and then shifting it into some sort of resolution, right? And one of the things I love to start with is complaints. Is we all know how to complain. We know how to complain. And I'll say, all right, you each get 3 minutes. I want to hear every single complaint you've got right now. Name it. Throw them all out there. All right, next guy, name them. I want to hear all of them. Is there more? Because this is your time to name it. So is there more? Let's go. All right, so what do you really want? Because every complaint is a poorly worded request. So what are the requests that they actually have? When we can get to the request, we've got something we can solve. I can't do much with complaints, and it kills our culture. I can do something with requests, but we've got to teach it.
I'm writing this stuff down, taking notes. I learn stuff all the time. So
I know, isn't it fun?
Yeah, I mean, usually it's the way it's said, like a phrase or stuff. It's always little nuggets here and there. So I really like that. Complaints are a poorly worded request. So I just like the way that phrase is. So, and it makes perfect sense. I mean, we don't complain about things that we like, right? We only a complaint is stuff that we don't like. And so whether it's justified or not, I mean, you may have a complaint that's completely unjustified or complete nonsense.
Well, but here's the deal. It's justified from where they're standing. If you're complaining about something, it's justified from where you're standing. It might not be justified from where I'm standing, but from where you're standing, it is a valid complaint. When I can meet you where you're at and say, Brad, I see from where you're standing the complaint that you have 100%. I don't see it that way. Here's how I see it, but I get where you're at. How do we move you to X, Y, or Z? When we can validate where somebody is versus making them wrong immediately, we've got much more room to build that trust and get a win-win outcome.
I think what's important here is like every one of your employees is an entire different ecosystem. There's no one size fits all, right? So, this one employee really likes it when you come and say hi to them every day and ask them how they're doing. This other employee just wants you to leave him alone and stop asking him questions, let him do his work. And so you have to really figure out each one of your employees and what makes them tick, what's important to them. One of the things I've heard on one of the interviews I did was about creating their goal board. A lot of us have vision boards or goal boards, but they have a company-wide goal board, and each employee would put on this board what they want, what their goals are. And so now the entire organization can see that. And then what happens is you start getting people to realize they have some similar goals or similar likes. And then they're working together to try to achieve that goal. And it really brings this, synergy around the culture of really trying to help each person be the best they can be or achieve what they want to achieve. And so, back to just, you have to know each person individually.
Yeah.
It's not a one size fits all.
For sure. There's 2 assessments that we use to do that. And they're both, one of them is validated for hire, and that's the predictive index. So, we use that with almost all of our clients. And then the other one is the 5 languages of appreciation. So you've probably heard of the 5 love languages. Like that was a big thing for a while. The 5 languages of appreciation is really tied into work. And exactly what you were saying is like, hey, I want the pat on the back. Hey, I want you just to come stand next to me and work with me. And that's how I know you appreciate me. I want you to publicly throw out all over the place, that I'm amazing and I'm great, and, I just need those, words of affirmation quietly because I want quality time with you. And that's how I know you appreciate me. So there's some really low cost assessments that are out there that have been statistically validated to be accurate that can make a huge difference in employee engagement. And that's key. So,
and you said the predictive index, that's more from like, well, you explain what that is actually.
Yeah. So predictive index it can be used for multiple different things. So it can be used for hiring folks. So essentially saying, hey, what's the natural behavior of an individual? And then what does this job need, right? So we need a craftsman or an artisan. We need somebody that's very process oriented and detail focused. They are analytical, and they're going to be responsive and work through a team. That's a lot of what our trades folks are, right? Is that they're this artisan, craftsman, very process focused, detail focused. Hey, if I have a deadline, it's written in stone and it needs to be perfect, right? Like I'm going to take pride when I walk out of that house of how it looks, right? I'm going to take pride of, the beam that I just placed in my welds. I don't want a bunch of bubble spider welds go to I want those things to be beautiful, right? That pride comes from somebody that's more like a craftsman or that has that high attention to detail. Well, if you've got a job that is not that, and you put them in it, a sales job, you've got a sales job
Right.
that is, you're going to lead independently. You need to talk all day long. When you see something, you have to make changes. You're not going to have a process to follow. You put your best welder out in a sales job, they're probably not going to be successful. But if you put that salesperson in a welding job with all this detail oriented work, they're probably not going to be successful. So that's one thing that PI does. Another is how does our team actually work together to get to the result that we need to get to as a team? Another one is, as a leader, am I leading you the way you need to be led?
That's a big one. I know we didn't get too much into leadership, but that is definitely back to the 5 languages of appreciation. Everybody wants to be led differently. Right. And so if you're trying to do the one size fits all, the square peg round hole mentality of, why can't you just do it the way I want it done? Why can't you just do it this way? It doesn't work universally across the board.
Yeah.
So I learned that the hard way being a prior military, it's all very top down, leadership. And so it's like when I started my own business, it's like, why? Go do this. What do why aren't you doing what I said? I said, do it. You should follow the orders. And it's like, that doesn't really work in the civilian world. You know what I mean? There's a lot more that goes into it. So we're getting close to the end here. I want to finalize with one last kind of question. And maybe you already talked about this, but what are some actionable steps that we can do or that contractors can, business owners can do to build a strong, engaged team that stays around?
Yeah. So to build that strong, engaged team that stays around, figure out what they want. I mean, just ask them. Ask them when you're hiring them, ask them as things are going so that we know exactly what that is and continue to check in. Hold your individuals accountable. So we talked kind of about this 4-step thing of, when I receive that as I feel, is that what you mean? That's one way of holding folks accountable. And what happens is, you'll start to see everyone start to step up. And so, we run leadership programs, and it's amazing when we bring 3 or 4 people in and do the coaching. And I'm sure you do this as well. All of a sudden, there's huge shifts in the quality and quantity of work getting done. Ensure you've got buy-wins on things. Clarity is key. So, if you're asking somebody to do something, tell them by when. Otherwise, you're setting them up to fail.
Deadlines, essentially, making sure we're putting a time frame on what that requirement is. It all comes down to just clear communication and, really actually caring about your staff, and trying to help them become successful. The adage is, if you want to become successful, help a bunch of other people become successful, or whatever. I forget the exact wording of that, but it's the same thing. So if I'm hiring employees, I'm like, what do you want? Where do you want to be in 5 years? You want to start your own business in 5 years? Okay, here's what you need to do. And here I can help you do that. I'm at least going to get 5 years of work out of you.
Right.
That's going to benefit me. And maybe you end up sticking around because you realize how hard it is and you change your path, you know. And I've had people ask me, well, how do I, you know, I got employees that want to go do their own thing. How do I keep them around? How do I keep them from doing that? How do I keep, you know, how do I make them stay here? And I'm like, what are you talking about? Like, why do you want to, you know, that's pretty selfish. Why do you want to keep them there if they're trying to better their situation?
Right. Yeah,
and
absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I've had so many consultants that are like, Traci, this has been absolutely amazing, but I'm ready for the next thing. And I couldn't have done that without XYZ. They got their SHRM certifications. They, you know, learned the leadership skills. They learned accountability at a higher level. They learned some of the sales and are like, I'm ready to go. I said, great. You know what our specialization is, and I know what yours is. It's different. I'd love to be a referral source for you.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's just, it's a scarcity mindset versus an abundance mindset at the end of the day, right? So having an abundance mindset where everyone can benefit, there's not a winner and a loser. Everyone can win in some capacity, and just really making sure your staff is, you know, that you take care of them, you know, be a servant leader, make sure they have everything they need, you know, clearly spell out what their responsibilities are and what the expectations are, and then hold them accountable to that. It seems really easy, but for whatever reason, it eludes us on a daily basis. And I'm sure it's because of the other 50,000 tasks we have to do, you know, on a day. But any final thoughts on any of the stuff that we talked about?
Fears what just came in, right? Like, you know, why do we do this all the time? Because we're afraid, you know? Yeah. So sometimes it's just asking yourself the question of, why am I doing the right thing? And if the answer is, I'm not sure, what am I afraid of? And that question of what am I afraid of will so often give you the answer to what you need to do. And it's typically not going to be the easy action to take.
Yeah, I always tell my guys, you know, whatever you have resistance towards is what you probably should be doing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, Traci, thank you so much for being on the show. I do always like to ask my guests one question, and that is, what's a book that you're currently reading or one that you would recommend?
Yeah. So I just finished reading 10 Times is Easier Than 2 Times. Dan Sullivan, phenomenal.
Yeah, that's a great book.
And Who Not How is another great one. Who do you need to bring on your team for you to truly be successful? So, you know, those are two good ones. I probably have 20, but we'll leave it there.
Yeah, both of those are great. The 10X is easier than 2X and the Who Not How. And those are, the Who Not How is actually a book that I give out to new people when they join my coaching program. I send them out that book because it's a great book. So Traci, thanks again for being on the show. I really appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you, Brad.
Awesome. Well, guys, that's the end of the show. I appreciate you hanging out with us. As always, you can find me on the social media platform. Just search for the Hammer and Grind Podcast or go to the show notes. You can learn more about Traci. We'll have links in there about your organization and what you do. And guys, remember, until next time, profit is not a dirty word.